Hello, we're here in Bucharest, and we welcome you all to this conversation on 140 years of Romanian-American diplomatic relations. We're lucky to have the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Mircea Geoana, whom I'm sure most people on this call know, and also Ambassador Mark Gitenstein, who's on the East Coast of the United States. Our conversation today will last 1 hour, and we'll leave the last 10 minutes for questions that will be posed by Raluca, who you just saw a moment ago. Right at the beginning, I wanted to thank, on behalf of Alianța, special thanks to Oracle for their contribution to this particular program. And also, I want to welcome and thank Dennis Dilettant, who will not be with us today, one of the foremost scholars of Romanian studies, 20th century studies. And he offers us an overview of a few minutes right at the beginning of the show. And of course, to Dorian Brania in New York at the Romanian Cultural Institute, who's done such a fabulous job and is our partner on this particular broadcast. So let me begin with a few words of introductions to Mircea Geoana, whom I think you all know. He was ambassador to Washington in Clinton's day, 1996 to 2000. I think it's fair to you were the youngest ambassador on the Romanian diplomatic corps at the time, and the best tennis player at the time. And there following, he became head of the PSD, the largest party in Romania at the time, before he took up his position as foreign minister from 2000 to 2004. From 2008 to 2011, he was president of the Senate, and in July of 2019, he was appointed Deputy General Secretary of NATO, and he joins us from Brussels. Mark Gitenstein on the East Coast, he served as ambassador from 2009 to 2012. He was nominated by President Obama in June of 2009. In fact, just before he left, President Traian Băsescu gave him the highest civilian order, which is the Star of Romania. I think Mark's well known for his work in fighting corruption, improving transparency, and strengthening the rule of law. He is Romanian of ancestry. His grandparents were born in Botoșani, and he attended and got degrees from Duke University and Georgetown Law School. His relationship with President-elect Biden began on his staff and later as chief counsel and minority chief counsel on the United States Senate Judiciary Committee. And more recently, he has served as a member of the transition team, the Biden-Harris transition team, and he continues his work with Fondul Proprietar, which we'll discuss, I think, in this conversation. Anyways, I begin the first question, which is an obvious question. What does Biden mean to the relations between the two countries?
Well, I assume that's directed to me. First of all, Vice President Biden has a deep relationship with Romania. He has been there probably 6 or 8 times, beginning in his time as a member of the U.S. Senate and then as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was there twice when he was vice president, once when I was there and once after I was there. His first major foreign trip as vice president was Central Eastern Europe, and it was to Romania and Poland and I think the Czech Republic. He gave his first major speech about the Obama administration's relationships with Central and Eastern Europe, or on Europe generally, in Bucharest at the library. So he has a deep commitment to Romania. He encouraged me to take the Romanian post primarily. He didn't tell me at the time because he and President Obama had decided to place the missiles in Devaselu in Romania, as part of the NATO program, which Mircea knows a lot more about than I do. And that was going to be done. I didn't realize at the time, and I think he wanted my help in trying to get the treaty through the Romanian Senate, which with Mircea's help, we were able to do quite easily. So he has always looked favorably upon Romania and will continue to do so. I think he will look at Romania, like every president has, as an important bulwark, especially in Central and Eastern Europe.
Mircea, you certainly have had long dealings with the Democratic side of the American politics. How do you see a Biden presidency in respect to Romania?
Oh, first of all, I think it will be a presidency where America's alliances in Europe and around the world will be strengthened. I think Romania should be proud of our strategic partnership with the US, and I would have to say that this is, bipartisan, both in Romania and also in America. But what President-elect Biden would definitely bring would be a tremendous volume of experience in global affairs. And I remember when I was a very young ambassador, and he was chairing the Foreign Relations Committee, Mark, I think, bringing over and over, and he accepting over and over lots of guys from Romania, making the pitch why Romania should join NATO. So he was very instrumental in Romania and also the other countries in Central Eastern Europe accession into NATO. And by the way, the accession into NATO paved the way for the EU accession for these countries. There is no other case in which a European nation joined the EU before joining NATO first. I remember also one thing, and I think that's quite, if you want, his deep conviction that democracy, integrity, and checks and balances and rule of law are indispensable parts of a prosperous and successful society. And I remember being invited when he visited, I think the second time, Mark. The first time I met him personally at the American Embassy. I have a photo here in my office in NATO with him. But the second time he had a speech, and he had a small quote speaking of the fight against corruption and the need for integrity for Romania and for any other nation. He was referring to Alexandru Ioan Cuza, and for Romanians, this conversation of the Romanian domnitor of those times with a peasant, speaking of Ocaua Mică, he made a very powerful Romanian, if you want, metaphor in this thing. So I believe he will be bringing tremendous predictability. I think he will be investing in America's alliances, and Romania's strategic partnership, I think, will flourish even more with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris at the helm of the American administration.
That's a very optimistic and encouraging beginning. I want to then, just before since we're talking about 140 years, to turn to Dennis Diletant's pre-recorded message. Raluca, do you have it there?
Yes, I do.
Okay, let it roll then. And then
I'm going to say a few words about the history of US-Romanian relations. So according to its practice in European matters, the US government waited until France, Britain, and Germany recognized Romania's independence on the 20th of February, 1880. It was only then that the US opened a legation in Bucharest. The first Romanian minister to the US, Constantin Angelescu, presented his letters of accreditation at the White House on the 15th of January, 1918. After the First World War, the US reverted to its policy of isolation in international affairs, that the US remained neutral until the declaration of war on Japan following the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. Romania declared war on the US on the 12th of December 1941, but it was only on the 5th of June 1942 that the United States declared war on Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Romania's leader, Gheorghiu Dej, embarked upon a policy of autonomy from the Soviet Union after 1956. The country reached out to the West to consolidate its commercial and cultural relations. Nicolae Ceausescu, on succeeding Gheorghiu Dej, continued to place what he regarded as Romania's interest above that of the Kremlin. Growing recognition of Romania's political usefulness as a thorn in the flesh of the Soviet Union prompted a period of increasing Western courtship of Ceausescu, exemplified by President Nixon's visit in August 1969. In 71, Romania was admitted to the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, so-called GATT, and in 1972, it was accepted into the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Throughout the 1970s, Romania expanded its foreign trade relations with the West to a greater degree than any other country in the East Central European bloc. That at the end of July 1975, President Ford granted Romania most favored nation tariff status. In March 1985, the Western support for Ceausescu faded. With the advent of Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, Ceausescu's usefulness as a bridge between East and West rapidly evaporated. In July 1988, Ceausescu renounced the most favored nation trade concessions in the face of White House and congressional demands for improved human rights performance. And from that date, Ceausescu's notoriety, we might say, in the US descended rapidly. And ultimately, we have, of course, the revolution of December 1989 and the execution of Ceausescu on Christmas Day 1989, and the beginning, with the collapse of communism, of a new era in US-Romanian relations.
Good, okay. Well, there's an overview. There's a longer version of that. Will be on the other platforms for about 11 minutes. But anyways, it allows the diplomats in this conversation to put on their historical hats a little bit. And I wanted to ask the question that in some way, Romanian-American relations have always been constructive. Obviously, World War I, World War II, at least at the end, even in the Ceausescu period, of course, 1969, and then after 89, it's in a funny way, it always seems to have a way of working itself out in a pragmatic way. Mircea and Mark, let's get your take on that. Why is that?
Mircea, why don't you go first?
Oh, thanks, Mark. Listen, when I arrived in 1996, Romanian ambassador to Washington, the first job at hand was to get the MFN status back to Romania. Ceausescu gave up, and by the way, Denis Delatant is a wonderful intellectual and historian, and we love him and respect him greatly. And that was and it was an attempt in 1995 by Romania, which failed in US Congress to take it back. So I'm just trying to tell you that the level of Romanian-US relationship after a very hesitant Romanian transition after 1989 was at a very low point. Very low point. Reputation was not very clear. While other countries were speaking about getting into NATO, Romania was fighting to get MFN status back. Us and North Korea were in that situation. But in the end, we turned it around. I remember vividly, you know, the big billboard in the House of Representatives with the votes. I think we got roughly 95% of the votes for that. What I'm trying to make the point is that history is not linear. There are moments in history where dramatic things happen and inflection points do occur. And I think if you want the merit of Romanian diplomats and political leaders over time were able to grasp such opportunities. My experience with the great moments is the strategic partnership between Romania and US itself. To be honest, because we plotted this in 1999 after Romania suffered a tactical defeat by not being invited to join NATO at the Madrid summit. So basically it was 2 or 3 of us with Strobe Talbot and Ron Asmus and myself in a small room someplace inventing the strategic partnership. So there was no preordained destiny for this thing. We just were able to grasp a moment, a difficult moment, and turn a tactical defeat into a strategic victory for Romania. And if today we have a strategic partnership which is flourishing, is also because at a certain difficult moment. So not everything is rosy. not everything is preordained. You have to fight when destiny, history, geography gives you a chance. And when you have it to get it, you get it. And that's I think my lesson from this thing. And I anticipate a long history of exceptionally close alliance between Romania and the US. No matter what will happen with other things, I do anticipate long historical cycle of an alliance between Romania and the US.
I think that's right. You were saying that history is not linear in your answer, Mircea. Do you see anything that would get in the way of the flow, which has been, despite the ups and downs you talked about, which has nonetheless been more or less in one direction? Do you see any scenarios that could upset that?
I think the alliance between America and Europe, between America and Romania, between America and its allies in many corners of the world, is based on two ingredients. One is common values, and the other one is common strategic interests. So as long as Romania, and I'm convinced that Romania will stay the course, irrespective of sometimes you slide, there are hesitations, there are mistakes, there are things. As long as Romania continues to invest in its democratic system, as long as we share the same values, as long as we also share common strategic, economic, and political interests, I think this relationship is sound, is solid, and is deepening and broadening with every cycle. And this is why my anticipation for the new American administration and the new American Congress, and for Romanian leadership and Romanian parliament and Romanian citizens, is for us to continue to invest in this indispensable relationship for Romania. That the indispensable relationship for Romania is this partnership and alliance with the US.
Mark, what's your thoughts? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a number of them. First of all, I agree with everything Mircea said. And first of all, the other thing, I should have said this at the beginning, I don't speak for the United States anymore. I'm not the US ambassador, and I don't speak for the forthcoming Biden administration either on these issues. I speak just as a citizen who has devoted much of the last decade to this group of issues. But I think one reason the alliance is so strong picks up on points that Mircea was making. I remember when they were when I heard how the decision was made to place the missiles in Romania that are in Devaselu now. It was explained to me how they went through the process of settling on Romania, and I won't go into the other 2 or 3 countries they looked at. But once you sat down and had to make a strategic decision about which country in this region of NATO is most important and reliable as an ally, it was not even close. Okay. First of all, Romania, I don't know if people are aware of this, but the German Marshall Fund does a survey, I believe it's the German Marshall Fund, every year, sort of gauging American support in every country in Europe, especially in NATO. And Romania frequently, I think even today, is the country where America is the most popular. So there's a deep well of support and kinship among the Romanian people about America. And, although Romania is not well enough known in the United States, and that's something Jim and I have been focusing on in creating Alianza, among elites, especially in the State Department and the military, flag officers, by the way, I had a flag officer in my office once a month from NATO or US Army Europe or, any of the US Navy, sort of reassuring and strengthening relations between the US military and Romania. Almost every month I was in as an ambassador. So at almost every level among the elite civil service in the United States, there's a deep recognition of the importance of Romania. No matter who the US ambassador is, I think Jim would agree with this. And I spent much time talking to Al Moses and Jim and Michael Guest, Nick Taubman before I became ambassador. It was clear to me that the staff that we would inherit as ambassadors and the infrastructure within the State Department always emphasized the importance of Romania militarily, politically, strategically to the United States. And when I got to Romania, it became clear to me that we shared many values on democracy, culturally, and in attitudes about the East. And I think there are inherent immutable forces strengthening that relationship no matter what. Now, I agree with Mircea. There are things that could happen in Romania that would undermine that relationship, and that is always a consistent concern to us. And one reason why every U.S. ambassador, from Al Moses to the present, has emphasized anti-corruption and transparency is because we view that as an essential ingredient to a stable democracy, which in turn is critical to an enduring alliance with an ally you can trust.
Thank you. Mircea, you were talking about the rough points here and there, and you, Mark, just mentioned immutable forces that move in the good direction. When you were serving, Mircea, in Washington and Mark in Bucharest, did you ever get to a point where you said they just don't understand what we're looking for? There's some misunderstanding here. Did you ever have that type of problem when you were serving on the ground in the other country? Mark.
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Well, it was often around the issues of corruption and transparency. It was almost as if, and as many of you know, I was attacked consistently about this as if I was serving some personal interest here. And by the way, it continues to this day because of my work on Fondul Proprietate, which is, I got on that board primarily because it became a platform for me to continue to advocate for greater transparency, especially in equity markets and reform of state-owned enterprises, which, of course, as you know, is the portfolio of Fondul Proprietate. That often I would get in arguments with people about why do you advocate this? Why do you care about this? And I always would say, look, we can't want this more than you do, but the reason we want this is because we believe it is inherent to a stable democracy that you have a rule of law, and that politics, which in Romania and increasingly, by the way, in the United States, has become increasingly what I call tribal, which is less concerned about principle and stewardship of the government and the democracy, and more about personal interest. That's dangerous, and it basically will destroy a democracy and makes a country unstable. And we don't want an unstable Romania. And besides, you know, for me as a Romanian, because of my Romanian ancestry, I have a deep commitment to the country and its success. So, but no matter whether you're a Romanian ancestry or not, if you're a U.S. ambassador, that's what you're worried about.
Mircea, when you were in Washington horse trading with Congress or the House, so forth, did you feel you sometimes dealt with people that didn't quite understand what Romania was about, what you were after?
No, I think it's one of the most formidable challenges from a smaller country to come to the biggest country in the world and try to make the case for Romania. Yeah. Why Romania? Why Romania into NATO? Why President Biden, I remember, was asking the Romanian Joint Chiefs visiting him in the US Senate, why should our sons and daughters die for Romania, defending Romania? I mean, these kind of relatively fundamental questions. And where there is the mix between values, integrity, but also a sense of catching up with the historical lost time that Romania was unfortunately obliged in doing. But what's interesting about America, that the people are so open. You know, the question is difficult to get to them. And I think the Romanian state should buy me shoes in perpetuity for free for the souls I have basically broken running on the corridors of US Congress, talking to any staffer, to anybody who was interested in listening about Romania, that he or she were my guys. I remember speaking of the Veselu with Sergiu Medar, who was the defense attaché at that time. We are going on the hill with maps of potential Iranian missiles across Europe. And of course, as Mark said, Romania is an obvious strategic place. But in America, there is this fantastic illusion for an ambassador or diplomats from smaller countries that they can really play major league, even if the country doesn't have all the ingredients of playing major league. If you work hard, if you're relentless, if you never give up, if you, as a Romanian saying goes, they throw you out the door, you come back through the window. I remember in mobilizing the Romanian American community was also another exceptional feat for me, because we are so desperate to get into NATO that we started to cross America and go to Romanian churches, Romanian communities. And I have to say they mobilized exceptionally well. We had a petition signed by, I think, 120,000 Romanian Americans for the White House and US Congress. When I arrived, there was only honorary consulate, one that your dad, Radu Florescu, God bless his soul, a great Romanian, a great patriot, was the only honorary consul we had in Boston. When I left, we had 20 honorary consulates. So if a country understands the importance of the relationship with America, and everybody around the world understands that, and you start really mobilizing everything you have and you do, and you're relentless, in the end, you succeed. That's the lesson from America, that everything is possible. Probably Romania will not become a G7 country anytime soon. I'm sorry, at least in my lifetime. But it doesn't mean that if you play your cards right, if you're serious, if you're predictable, if you really invest in this relationship, that Romania is not, and today Romania is a very trusted ally and partner of America, and this is something good. This is also helping us in Europe, helping us in the neighborhood, helping us around the world. So that's great about America, that people are very open. The moment you get to talk to them, they are easygoing, and that's what I love about talking to American, not only politicians or diplomats, but also to American citizens. They are exceptionally open and ready to listen to your argument, if you have any, of course.
Thank you. That's a very nice word about my dad. I was just looking at his work, and he pointed out that the first diplomatic relations occurred by the governor, then governor, or to become governor of Virginia, Captain John Smith, who went to Alba Iulia in 1615. So we have really more than 140 years, but it goes back a long time. You were mentioning the thing, Mircea, about open. Mircea, how about you? I mean, Mark, how about you when you were in Bucharest? What was the thing that sort of caught your eye about the character or the quality, the special quality of Romanian people?
Well, first of all, they're very warm people. They could also be hotheads. There could be, but they're very rarely mean-spirited. And I was welcomed with open arms in Romania. And I think what was, I was the first Romanian American ever to hold the job as U.S. ambassador. And people were excited about that. And before I could even say a word, many of them would actually say that to me, and made me feel really good. I remember I used to, I love the cultural opportunities in Bucharest, and in particular. And I was at the Athenaeum one night at a piano concert recital. And I remember turning around and looking at the people, and they all looked familiar, even though they weren't related to me. And I think it's because I was Romanian. I mean, the other story I love to tell is when I went to Botoșani for, I think, the first or second time, the mayor there, I can't remember who it was at the time, introduced me to, I think I told the story on that videotape I did the other day, and said, I want to welcome you to Botoșani. And I interrupted him. My wife always gets nervous when I do that. And I say, I hate to contradict you, Your Honor, but you're welcoming me to my ancestral home. And, I feel at home here. And I always did feel at home in Romania. So I think that was the other thing is, just look out this window here is, Romania looks like the United States, or like what I remember the United States. You could be in the Danube Delta here looking out this window. Beautiful wetlands and in the mountains of the Rockies. I have a house. I live actually most of the time in Seattle, and the Cascades are behind me, and that could be the Carpathian Alps. So it physically looked the same. The people felt, like they shared I know they shared our values, and they certainly shared our aspirations. So I felt at home in Romania. I still do.
Felt at home. And then, let me ask you a question, Mark. You know, almost in literature and history, people always talk about the shadowy ways by which Romania operates, or the Balkans. Did you ever feel that dealing with, let's say, with the political world?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's a very Byzantine politics. You know, there are people like Mircea and other reformers who have made a difference in Romania. And I think the trend line, as Dr. King used to say, the arc of time, history bends towards justice. And I think the arc of history of Romanian politics is towards greater democracy and a closer connection with the West. But I also agree with Mircea, it's not inevitable. Nothing, you know, as we've learned in the last 4 years here in the United States, you know, reform and expansion of a multicultural democracy is not inevitable in the United States, and it's not inevitable in Romania.
Both of you, as diplomats, carried the ball down the field, and you've both talked about that. Mircea, with the difficulties of MFM and things like, and other challenges there. Is there anything, let's say, I'll begin with you, Mark, unfinished business that I wish I just got this job done a little bit more pushed ahead?
Well, you know, to use an American expression, I broke a lot of eggs over the issue of corruption. And I'm very proud of the fact that I did that. I want to continue to do work in that space. And I think that the reason I joined the Fondul board was because one of my great regrets as ambassador is I didn't think I did enough to help reform equity markets and make businesses and state-owned enterprises more transparent. Because what I learned about corruption is you can't just, you know, indict and convict everybody in Romania. That doesn't solve the problem. You have to make structural changes to make corruption less enticing and less inevitable. And I learned that state-owned enterprises were the venue for a lot of mismanagement, lack of transparency, and corruption, quite frankly. And the problem with that is those enterprises are basically owned by Romanians, by Romanian shareholders or voters. And, you know, Romanian pension funds own huge swaths of these, either through Fondul Proprietate or directly to some of these entities. And they need to be reformed. It's the essential next step in ending a command and control economy is to bring equity markets and greater transparency into the management of the economy generally, but certainly of the state-owned enterprises. And in any emerging democracy, creating wealth has to come through building equity markets, through IPOs and other activities. The banks cannot finance reform by themselves. It has to come through investment. That's why Poland, at least until recently, was quite successful in this space. They built their equity markets. And I always thought that was I didn't do enough in that space. And so it's one reason I have spent so much time at Fondul Proprietate.
Mircea, how about you? Unfinished business.
Listen, many of the, let's say, the anchors of the Romanian-American relationship, the strategic partnership itself, the Romanian caucus on Capitol Hill, the things that were started before me, the National Guard of Alabama and Romania. I remember managing to convince US Congress to invite former President Constantinescu to a joint address in front of the US Congress, a joint session of Congress, which I hope next Romanian presidents will be able to replicate. But where I feel that we have done all of us enough of a good job from Romania, I mean, irrespective of the political affiliation and whatever, and the Byzantine politics of Romania. That's the culture of the land. I think we have not moved aggressively enough towards a comprehensive strategy of engaging America in its depth. So I think we just rely on, you know, how many visits do we have? And by the way, since President Clinton, President G.W. Bush, and Vice President Biden, we didn't have much of high-level visit to Romania. But I think what I believe we should try to do is to understand that America is a huge country. It's a complex country. And nothing that you have achieved is given to you in perpetuity. You have to invest. It's a very asymmetrical relationship. A huge global superpower and a medium-sized power, of course, relevant, important in the region. But I think that we have not been able to have a method of engaging America and engaging also American public opinion, American newspapers, opinion makers, think tanks. There is no Romanian presence, physical presence in one think tank in Washington as we speak. These are things that I believe, for me, are things that need to be corrected. And if there is something I can, say about myself, that I was probably, when I had important political positions in Romania, there was not even myself able to convince my colleagues. I hope that the new Romanian parliament, because there is a pro-America caucus in the Romanian parliament, they will be in the position to engage the new US Congress and broaden the caucus on Romania. So what I think that relying only on your military colleagues and your intel colleagues, and you have to invest much more. America is a huge country. You have to invest, far more professionally and far more in a diversified way if you want to have real influence and enduring influence, not only in Washington, but across America. From Seattle, speaking of Mark, all the way to Florida, and from the Midwest all the way to California, you have to be always on campaign mode. With America, you have always to be on campaign mode because the country is too big and too complex just to wait for presidents or prime ministers or a few diplomats to do the job. All of us have to do the job.
It needs a wider footing. Now that's, I suppose, a question for both of you, that under the Obama administration, Obama seemed like he had pivoted towards the Pacific, and Vice President Biden was deputized, it seemed, more than most to be looking after Europe. Do you think that becomes more difficult now? And I know you have both different perspectives on it. Mark, you being a Biden man, and Mircea, you're seeing it from both sides now, and also NATO. Will it be more difficult to get a Biden administration to keep their eyes on Europe, or will they follow in the Obama pivot? What do you think, Mircea?
No, I don't think that a Biden administration will basically not engage with Europe, which is just the opposite. If I understand correctly, from also from the foreign affairs piece that President-elect Biden has published, what also I hear from some of his colleagues, that he will be trying to basically coalesce all American alliances around the world. And then you have 30 nations, 29 American allies, 28 because Canada and the US are North America. You start with Europe because that's the backbone of your alliances. So what I think will happen, we'll see a strengthening of America's alliances with Europe in NATO, and also with like-minded nations from all over the world, mainly Asia Pacific, with Australia, with Japan, with Korea, with New Zealand, with India. So I believe that the transatlantic bond will remain very vibrant and developed. I'm not concerned about this. I think that also Europe has to understand that the rise of China is a challenge also for us. So I think when President Biden will come for the NATO summit sometime next year, and also when he will be engaging the EU leadership also sometime next year, we'll have clarity. But I'm confident and convinced that the transatlantic bond will continue to be if you want, the essential component of American global democratic engagement.
Mark, going back to
can I respond to that? First of all, again, I reemphasize I'm speaking for myself, not for the United States or for the Obama administration, but I strongly agree with what Mircea said. I wanted to pick up on a point that Mircea made earlier, and then I'll come back to this, your question, John. Actually, Mircea and I talked a little bit about this when I was ambassador, and Van Demicescu also was pushing me on this as well. And that is, the Romanian American community is not well organized in the United States. And I don't know how Mircea was able to do what he did, but you know, we have worked at Alianza for that very purpose, to try and strengthen the bonds of Romanian American organizations with each other and have them all rowing in the same direction, and towards a strengthening of the relationship between the two countries in the United States. I'll never forget, I think it may have been President Băsescu or somebody asked me, sort of annoyed at one point, about why was it so hard for Romania to get 8 M16s when Poland had, you know, like 24 F-16s. And I said to whoever it was, I said, you know what the largest Polish city in the world is outside of Warsaw? Chicago, okay? And they are very well organized. And they can get the attention of people on the Hill and an administration much better than you do. And I think you need to build that wellspring of support. And that's what we have been trying to do at Alianza, and it's extremely important. But anyhow, I took us off a little on the sideline, but I thought Mircea's point was right and needed to be reemphasized. And it's the whole purpose of Alianza, to try and do that. But John, I interrupted you. You had another question.
No, actually, you raised another interesting point, because I remember when Obama first ran for the office, Radu and I were in charge of Romanian Americans for Obama. And I was always struck at how many Romanian Americans were not that big on Democrats. It's sort of like a new, there's a new kind of Romanian American that is somewhat detached, somewhat politicized, or maybe even depoliticized. Do you have any thoughts on that, particularly in light of the fact that you mentioned this thing about a non-united Romanian community?
Well, I think to give credit where credit's due, for, you know, I don't know if it's totally fair, but it's certainly the perception in Romania and with many immigrant groups in the United States who care about Russia, is that they credit Ronald Reagan with bringing down the Iron Curtain. And to that extent, as we know, that is a that's cluster of issues around the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, not necessarily Russia today, but some of Russia today. Ronald Reagan gets the credit for doing that. Now, in fairness, it's actually started with Harry Truman, with building NATO, et cetera, as Mircea can tell you. I mean, there's a long history of this, that it's actually not partisan. But the president that many Romanians, I think, credit with doing that was Reagan and the Republican Party. Now, as you know, Biden was heavily, if there was a Democrat who cared as deeply as Reagan about that, that was probably then Senator Joe Biden. So I think that's part of it. You know, we'll see where it goes in the future. I'm, as Mircea, is quite optimistic about where we're headed.
Mircea, you were talking a moment ago about the Pacific and China and the interest of Europe and the United States. Do you see NATO playing a different role in trying to kind of soften the rise of China in collaboration with the United States? Do you see an opportunity to step up that game?
Listen, NATO leaders in London last year decided and instructed us to look more carefully into the implications on security, because that's what NATO is all about, of the rise of China. And we do this. We do this and we'll continue to do this because it's a major superpower that has explicit ambitions to become #1 in the world, not only in terms of economy, but also in terms of military and technology. And as we know, there is always a relationship between the economy, the technology, and military prowess. Today, China is having the second largest defense budget in the world after the US. And that's why I come back to the need of alliances. You know, if you look at NATO, the 30 countries in NATO, the 30 allies in NATO, we still have 50% of global GDP and more than 50% of defense spending in the world. And that's why I believe that like-minded nations should look into the rise of China also as an opportunity, because it's a major market. There's also opportunities to do things with them. Hopefully, they will be playing a constructive role when it comes to world order. But when it comes to the challenges of the rise of China, we are of course very attentive, and we do our homework, making sure. And we are not getting closer to NATO, closer to China. They are coming close to us with Silk and Road Initiative, Belt and Road Initiative, purchasing critical infrastructures in Europe, being present in our neighborhoods. So in a way, it's something that we are. It's an obligation for a security and defense alliance to look into a global shift in geopolitics and geoeconomics and defense capabilities. So of course, doesn't mean that Russia doesn't continue to be a major concern to all of us. Look at the kind of new generation of missiles, and they just finished a major nuclear exercise just the other day. But China's rise is probably the most important evolution in geopolitics in if not decades, in centuries probably, since the preeminence of the West half a millennia ago.
Do you think that Biden's election will signal a deepening of relationships from NATO to Japan, Australia, South Korea, and maybe New Zealand? Do you see that gives a renewed spark to deepen those relationships?
I think it will. We already have a very strong partnership between NATO and these 4 Asia-Pacific partners. They are exceptionally close to us. In the last few foreign ministers meetings of NATO and defense ministers meeting of NATO, we had also the foreign and defense ministers of Australia attending some of the sessions that we do. We engage actively with those. We're also looking into what the US is building into the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, also the openings with India. So I anticipate, yes, that not only in Asia-Pacific, but also I think around the world. And the idea of President-elect Biden to have a summit of democracies is also something that makes a lot of sense. Because in the end, I come back to what unites all of us, which is our values. And China is not reflecting our values. China is promoting a different type of societal model, which is not our open, free, and democratic society model.
Mark, what's your view on that?
Well, as there are certain immutable strategic imperatives that drive the relationship between Romania and the United States, it's also true between the EU and the United States. And a lot of it is economic. I mean, I think the United States is probably the largest trading partner with the EU. I don't know if the converse is true, but it's pretty close to true. And the ties are very deep, both economically and culturally, and because of NATO, militarily and strategically. So there's an inevitability to it. No matter what anybody wanted, we would be driven towards our relationships with the UK and the EU. I'm not worried about this concern about the pivot towards Asia. You have to pay a lot of attention to Asia, if for no other reason, the one that Mircea mentioned, it's got the second largest military in the world, and it's forward leaning as to what it wants to do. It is a strategic competitor of the United States.
Mircea, you mentioned a moment ago Turkey, and of course Turkey just purchased these S-400 air defense systems. How concerned are you about that, given the fact that even a few years ago there's so much talk of Turkey coming into the family of NATO?
Listen, we raised this issue with our Turkish allies, and Secretary General Stoltenberg raised it also directly in Ankara just, I think, 2 weeks ago. I did it this morning in a video chat with some of the Turkish representatives. I think this is something that, of course, it's a sovereign decision of Turkey to purchase whatever equipments they deem appropriate for them. But when it comes to NATO and our common defense system, a missile defense system, we believe that the acquisition of this Russian missile defense system is, number one, totally different, will never be accepted as part of the NATO defense system. And I think that Turkey should try to find, even if it's relatively late in the game, some alternative solutions that would be Western technology and compatible with NATO interoperability standards.
We're moving up to question time in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to put you back as ambassadors and ask you to think back to some many years ago. And what did you learn from your American experience, Mircea, where you thought, I wish we had a little bit more of this ingredient in Romanian life? And I'll ask the inverse question to Mark.
For me, optimism, and a sense that the sky is the limit. I think sometimes Romanians, including myself, sometimes we tend to underestimate ourselves. The country is of great potential. The country has, as Mark has said, wonderful people, smart, hardworking. If you put them in the right context, they perform like crazy. I think sometimes we lack a little bit of this sense of optimism and a sense of self-confidence. If we correct that a little bit, I think the sky is the limit.
Mark, on your end, sky's the limit for Mircea, if we have a little more confidence.
Well, first, let me add to what Mircea said. I used to give a speech. I think Mircea heard me give it when I was an American. That one of the problems with Romanians is asta este viața. Nothing can change. Everything's going to be the same. And, you know, I said, I think you need a little more of Obama's "yes, we can." And I agree very fundamentally with Mircea about that. But I've seen a lot of change in that respect in the last 10 years, for the better. I don't know, what I always appreciated about Romanians, which I wish we saw more in the United States, was a true appreciation of her history. And the people that I spent time with and I admired the most in Romania, the reformers, really appreciated the value of democracy and the rule of law. And they cared a lot about it. The ones that I dealt with, you know, the investigative reporters, the reformers, the people in the parties who cared about reform, the prosecutors, and many judges. I know there's at least one or two of the judges on the call, I can tell from chats back and forth, who are listening. And I really, truly admire them. And I think in America now, there's more appreciation of this than when I left Romania in 2012. And that is, our democracy is fragile and we can lose it. Romanians understand that intuitively. They have lost their democracy and regained it, okay? And, you know, I think we in America now understand that better than we did in 2012. And I think with the election of Joe Biden as president, we have seen that our institutions are quite resilient and can survive challenges, but they can't survive them forever. And they are more fragile than we think.
Since both you two have been out of town and I've been in town, you'd be pleased to know that Obama's book is selling very well at Cautureș all over town and translated beautifully in Romanian. Mircea, you were mentioning the thing about the openness, which is a subject, and the qualities and transparency that you always stress at the Aspen Institute meetings in Bucharest. Now turning slightly to the future, just before we take a few questions, what's the unfinished business for Biden? And maybe you've touched on this in roundabout ways. Unfinished business for the 46th president. Mark, we'll start with you since he just paid you a visit.
Well, I don't speak for Biden on this. I just speak for myself. I think he would recognize that as far as Romania is concerned, is that what you're asking? You know, what's the unfinished? I think it's what I talked about. It's continuing to strengthen the relationship both militarily and culturally, and again, continuing to strengthen and deepen the democracy, both as a rule of law and in terms of free markets. Excuse me.
Mircea, what would you like to see as the agenda on his desk in Romania?
You know, I'm not in the position to speculate on this thing, but I do know that President Biden's deep and sophisticated knowledge of our region and of Europe and international affairs will benefit us greatly. So my case would be for the Romanian decision makers is to take this opportunity and use it to its utmost. It's not only up to the American president or American Secretary of State or the head of the Pentagon or whatever, or US Congress to do. It's also for, as I mentioned, it's an asymmetrical relationship. Yeah. And the smaller partner has always to be creative and invest and use this opportunity, because I think they'll be open to smart, articulated, serious arguments coming from Bucharest and from Romania to move this alliance between the two countries to the next level. That's my ambition, to see an American president visiting Romania in the next years, which I remember being with President Clinton, with President G.W. Bush. I hope the Romanians will see an American president visiting Romania in the next years, if it's possible. But it's up to the Romanians to play ball. Don't expect everything to come from the other side.
Yeah,
you have to play your cards. Romania has cards to play, and I think Romania should play those cards.
Very positive message. Now, I just want to turn to some questions. Raluca, do you have some questions for us?
We actually have a number of really good questions that came in. Because our time is limited, I wanted to apologize in advance for not being able to get to everybody's questions, but please do visit our website at alianta.org and follow us on social media. We want to be able to continue this conversation, and hopefully, if we don't get to all of your questions now, keep it interactive and continue to communicate with everybody and answer everybody's questions. I have the first question for Mr. Geoana from George Roth, who happens to be the honorary consul of Romania in San Francisco. The question is, you were the ambassador who basically created a network of honorary consul Court of Romania, where I am a member of. You created more than 20 honorary consuls in the US. My question is, how did you get this idea? Was somebody, did somebody suggest this to you? Romania didn't have a tradition about this at all.
Hello, George. I look forward to, and also your son is an Aspen fellow. He went to the leadership programs of our institute. I think I did it out of despair. We're so desperate to catch up with Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic to get into NATO and the others that we had basically to build from scratch. Of course, there are other countries that have even even broader network of honorary consulates. I think there are countries that have consulates in every single American state. But it was basically an investment in a network, let's put it openly, of influence. And some of them were Romanian Americans. Others were just Americans that have an interest in Romania. So I think that also to tell you the whole thing, also Sorin Ducaru, who was my successor as ambassador to Washington, has also done a fantastic job in also continuing to push for this. So if I would be in the situation to recommend to the Romanian diplomats that will be in charge of this leadership, go and have a honorary consul in every single American state. We have to travel.
Thank you.
Okay.
A question for Mark from Brian Jardine. Do you anticipate the incoming Biden administration will promote Romania as a viable investment market for US companies, particularly in such industries where Romania has a competitive advantage like IT, TMT, such that assuming Romania remains committed to anti-corruption and rule of law, we will witness an increased level of US foreign direct investment into Romania over the next 4 years?
Well, first of all, great to hear from you, Brian. Brian is a dear friend, and I've talked to him at length about these issues. If you were to ask me, what would I rather have? A couple $100 million worth of direct investment in the United States, or having President Biden come to Bucharest, I would choose the former. And I think the former, I think that's more important, to have Romania become a destiny for serious U.S. investment. And by the way, I think one reason why of the $2 billion in investment in the Fondo Proprietate, a substantial portion of that is American, is because they trust Fondo Proprietate as a transparent and well-run, safe place to put money to enter the Romanian market. The Romanian market is naturally attractive because of the talent of the workforce and the assets that could be purchased. The only barrier to investment in Romania right now is the lack of transparency in certain of these institutions. And to the extent you open your markets and you make them more transparent, that will attract more investment. And why is that good for Romania? Not only does it make more money available and more jobs available for young Romanians, but especially when investments are made in state-owned enterprises, it makes the Romanian investments in those institutions more valuable. Take Hidroelectrica, for example. Fondul Proprietate only owns 20% of Hidroelectrica, but every time we do something to reform Hidroelectrica, which is, by the way, one of the great success stories in Romania, the 80%, which is owned by Romanians, increases in value by the same percentage. And to the extent you open these institutions to greater investment, you will increase the share value that Romanians own in these companies. And I think it's extremely important that there be greater transparency to attract greater investment. So I strongly agree with the implication of Brian's question.
Raluca, I think I'm going to step in because I promised both our guests not to take more than an hour. And this is really a fascinating, I'd call it a highly personalized analysis by Friends of Romania and for Romanians. So it was a real treat, I think, for everybody watching. I want to thank once again Oracle and obviously the Romanian Cultural Institute for getting this as far and wide as possible. So thank you all for your time. It was superb and enjoyable and interesting. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
Bye now.